12. That's how many times one manufacturer has beaten every other four-wheel drive on Earth at the hardest endurance rally that exists, and it isn't Toyota. The Land Cruiser's reputation was built on dealer lot reliability and desert crossing folklore, not on a scoreboard. These 10 four-wheel drives have the scoreboard. Some of them beat the Land Cruiser in an actual competition decades before most people even considered it the benchmark. One of them is still undefeated. If you're hunting for one of these four-wheel drives, this could save you thousands. A full checklist that catches rust before you buy, not after. 27 bucks. Scan the code or check the description. Number 10. Suzuki Samurai/SJ410. By the mid-1980s, Toyota had already built its reputation on the Land Cruiser's ability to survive continents of abuse. Suzuki built a four-wheel drive that weighed less than a modern hatchback and could outclimb it anyway. The Samurai's factory curb weight comes in under 2,000 pounds, and that single number changes everything about how a hill climb, a rock ledge, or a mud bog actually plays out. Weight is the enemy of traction in low-speed technical terrain, and the Samurai simply didn't have any to fight against. A machine that light can sit on top of soft ground, where a heavier four-wheel drive sinks straight through it. What made it dangerous in a real test wasn't raw power. The Samurai's 1.3-liter four-cylinder produced barely 63 horsepower in US trim, a fraction of the Land Cruiser's inline-six, but paired with a proper two-speed transfer case, a live front axle, and leaf springs tuned for articulation rather than comfort. That low power-to-weight ratio meant the Samurai could crawl a line the heavier Toyota had to power through. Off-road racers noticed first. The SJ platform became a fixture in early rock crawling and desert competition, precisely because featherlight four-wheel drives with real low range punched above their spec sheet. A Land Cruiser hauling nearly double the mass onto the same loose incline needed more traction to move the same distance, and traction is the one thing steep, broken ground refuses to guarantee, no matter how strong the engine underneath it is. The irony is that Suzuki never marketed the Samurai as a Land Cruiser rival. It was sold as an affordable, cheerful runabout, and that reputation stuck so hard that most owners never pushed it past a gravel trail. But the ones who did found a four-wheel drive that could thread gaps a full-size wagon had to detour around entirely. Decades later, lifted and mud-tired Samurais remain a staple of technical rock trails, specifically because nothing else in this price range matches the power-to-weight math. The Land Cruiser will always win on comfort, payload, and highway manners. On a tight, technical line where mass is the enemy, and every extra pound has to be fought uphill, the featherweight Suzuki gets through first, and it doesn't need 6 cylinders to do it. Suzuki's own engineers reportedly never expected the SJ chassis to develop the following it did in competitive rock-crawling circles, which makes the platform's second life as a purpose-built off-road specialist even more striking against a Land Cruiser built from day one to chase that exact reputation. Would a modern turbocharged Land Cruiser still outcrawl a machine built on the idea that less weight beats more power? Number 9. Toyota Mega Cruiser. There's no head-to-head test between the Mega Cruiser and the standard Land Cruiser anywhere on record, mainly because Toyota built the Mega Cruiser specifically to outclass its own flagship, and it never got a real competitor to prove it against in public. Developed for the Japan Self-Defense Forces as a rough answer to the American Humvee, the Mega Cruiser used portal axles at all 4 corners, the same basic principle that gives military trucks like the Pinzgauer their extreme ground clearance, paired with a width and wheelbase built specifically to keep the chassis level, while individual wheels dropped into terrain, a standard Land Cruiser's suspension. Geometry couldn't absorb without grounding the underbody out on the trail. The capability case here has to be built from specifications rather than a scoreboard, and the specifications are genuinely lopsided in the Mega Cruiser's favor. The portal-geared axles gave it far greater static ground clearance than any production Land Cruiser of the same era, Four-wheel steering tightened its turning circle, despite a footprint wider than a full-size pickup truck, and a reinforced ladder frame under a purpose-built military body meant payload and durability numbers, engineered for battlefield recovery duty rather than family road trips to a campsite. Toyota sold a small civilian run alongside the military contract, reportedly around 150 units total across both programs, which is exactly why almost nobody has driven one, let alone tested it directly against the Land Cruiser it was internally designed to outperform on paper. That rarity is precisely why this entry belongs on the list rather than off it. A four-wheel drive doesn't need a highlight reel win to prove a capability gap when the engineering brief already spells it out in black and white. Toyota built the Mega Cruiser because the standard Land Cruiser's geometry had a hard ceiling, and the corporation's own defense contract answer to that ceiling never had to justify itself to a single Land Cruiser owner's dealership brochure or forum thread. Japanese enthusiast forums that track Mega Cruiser sightings still treat a roadworthy civilian example as a genuine unicorn, which only reinforces how little real-world data exists to challenge the capability case built from its own engineering brief. Specs built for a defense contract rarely get a public rematch, but that doesn't make the underlying capability gap any less real. If Toyota itself thought the standard Land Cruiser wasn't enough, what does that say about the ceiling on the trucks the rest of us actually drive? Number 8. Mercedes-Benz Unimog. There's no publicized Land Cruiser comparison for the Unimog for a simple reason. The two trucks were never really built to compete in the same category, and the gap in favor of the Mercedes is wide enough that nobody has ever bothered to stage the test formally. Developed in post-war Germany as a universal motor gear for farming and later adopted by armies, fire services, and expedition operators worldwide, the Unimog runs portal axles at both ends, the same hub reduction geometry used by military-grade specialists like the Pinzgauer and the Mega Cruiser earlier on this list, giving it static ground clearance that dwarfs anything a standard Land Cruiser chassis has ever offered, stock or heavily modified. The case built from specifications alone is not subtle. Portal axles combine with a fully articulating frame, weighting depth deep enough on some variants to submerge a Land Cruiser's air intake entirely, and payload ratings measured in multiple tons, rather than the hundreds of kilograms a passenger four-wheel drive typically carries. Figures that put the Unimog closer to a medium commercial truck than to any factory SUV. Central tire inflation systems on many variants let the driver adjust tire pressure on the move for sand or mud conditions, a capability no factory Land Cruiser trim has ever offered from the showroom floor in any generation. This is the weakest sourced entry on the list, precisely because nobody has run a formal side-by-side comparison. The argument rests entirely on portal axle geometry and payload class, rather than a rally trophy or a magazine scoreboard result. That absence of a head-to-head is itself the point worth sitting with. The Unimog was never positioned as a Land Cruiser rival, because it was built one tier above that entire fight. A portal axle platform engineers reach for specifically once a Land Cruiser's ground clearance and payload ceiling stop being enough for the job in front of them. If the real test, this whole list, is built around ever actually happened between these two, the spec sheet alone suggests the Land Cruiser wouldn't be the one setting the pace. Overlanding outfitters who operate both platforms commercially tend to reserve the Unimog for routes where a stuck Land Cruiser would need the Unimog to come pull it out, which is about as practical a verdict on the capability gap as exists outside a formal test. A payload class built for medium trucks, rather than passenger SUVs, isn't a fair fight to begin with, and it was never meant to be won. If the vehicle that tows a stock Land Cruiser out of the mud is still not considered a rival to it, what does that actually say about the ranking? Number 7. Steyr-Puch Pinzgauer 710/712. Austria's Steyr-Daimler-Puch built the Pinzgauer to solve a problem the Land Cruiser was never actually asked to solve. Keep every wheel planted while carrying a full payload up gradients, steep enough to stop a mule train. The answer was portal axles. Gearboxes housed at each hub that lift the differential well above axle centerline, combined with a central backbone chassis and swing axle geometry at all four corners. The result was ground clearance and wheel travel that let a Pinzgauer walk over obstacles a solid axle Land Cruiser would have to grind through, all while carrying a payload that shamed most of its lighter, more road-oriented rivals on the same terrain. Swiss and Austrian mountain infantry didn't choose the Pinzgauer for comfort. They chose it because it was rated to climb gradients over 100%. Vertical rise, equal to horizontal distance. Fully loaded, on terrain where a wrong wheel placement meant a rolled truck rather than a stuck one. That capability wasn't theoretical marketing language. It's a documented spec figure, verified across multiple technical sources. For a fully laden 4x4, a rating no standard Land Cruiser of the same era, running solid axles without portal gearing, has ever matched on paper. What the Pinzgauer never got was the marketing machine Toyota built around the Land Cruiser. It stayed a specialist tool, sold in small numbers to militaries and mountain rescue services, rather than to families wanting a reliable overlander for weekend camping trips. And that obscurity is exactly why it's absent from most toughest 4x4 conversations online. But obscurity isn't the same as inferiority. On the one terrain type built to separate real off-road engineering from brand reputation, portal-geared Austrian military trucks were doing geometry math the Land Cruiser's suspension simply couldn't answer. Gradient after gradient, decade after decade of continuous service. Restoration specialists who've driven both machines back-to-back describe the Pinzgauer's uphill traction as being on a different level entirely. Less a matter of horsepower, and more a matter of a chassis that simply refuses to let a wheel go light. Gradient math doesn't care which badge is more famous, and on paper the Pinzgauer's numbers simply outclass a standard Land Cruiser's factory geometry. If portal axles gave the Pinzgauer that much of an edge in the mountains, why did almost nobody bring that geometry to a mainstream four-wheel drive? Number 6. Volvo C303. Most of the four-wheel drives on this list have to make their case from spec sheets and owner testimony. The Volvo C303 doesn't need either. It already has a scoreboard. In January 1983, a factory Volvo Trucks team drove a nearly stock C303, fitted with little more than a roll bar and an extra fuel tank, into the Paris-Dakar Rally's brutal light truck class. Driver Hasse Henriksen, alongside co-driver Sture Bernhardsson and mechanic John Granang, finished the rally in 20th place overall and second among every truck entered, taking the outright class win for vehicles under 10 tons. A result the Land Cruiser has never matched in a comparable factory-entered class at the same event. The C303 wasn't built as a rally car. It was a Swedish military cross-country vehicle developed from the late 1960s, L3 314 series, powered by a 3.0-litre straight six, pulled from Volvo's own road, going 164 sedan, and roughly three-quarters of the 8,700-odd units built went straight into service with European and Malaysian armed forces, rather than showrooms. That heritage is exactly why the Dakar result matters. Nobody engineered this machine to win a desert race. It won because a boxy military hauler with generous ground clearance and a torque-heavy inline six could survive 6,000-plus miles of Saharan terrain that broke faster, flashier entries, then come home with a class trophy nobody expected it to take, mounted today in the Volvo Museum in Gothenburg as proof it happened. The Land Cruiser has plenty of desert crossing folklore behind it, but folklore isn't a finishing position. The C303 has an actual placing at the single hardest endurance rally on Earth, driving in a class built specifically to punish vehicles that couldn't take sustained abuse over thousands of miles of sand, rock, and washboard track. A four-wheel drive that wins its class at Dakar has already passed a tougher real test than most Land Cruisers will ever see in their entire service life, and it did it in a stock military truck most people have never even heard of. Volvo never built a second-generation rally program around the result, which is exactly why the C303's single Dakar class win reads less like a marketing stunt and more like an accident of good, honest engineering, meeting a punishing course head-on. A stock military hauler beating purpose-modified rivals to a class trophy is precisely the kind of result a spec sheet alone could never predict. How many other stock military trucks are sitting in a museum somewhere with a Dakar trophy nobody ever talks about? Number 5. Lada Niva. The Land Cruiser earned its reputation running leaf-sprung solid axles the way four-wheel drives had been built for decades. In 1977, a Soviet factory in Tolyatti quietly built something that made that formula look outdated. One of the very first mass-production four-wheel drives with a unibody chassis, and the first to pair that with independent front suspension and permanent all-wheel engagement, all wrapped around a car small enough to park sideways. On paper, it sounds like a compromise. In practice, the Niva's independent front end let each wheel articulate over broken ground, without unloading the opposite side the way a rigid axle does, and permanent four-wheel drive with a lockable center differential meant it never had to wait for a driver to shift into gear before finding traction on a sudden patch of ice or loose scree. The proof came from places that don't hand out easy praise. European magazines that pitted the Niva against contemporary Land Cruisers and Land Rovers on Alpine and Saharan test routes repeatedly found it matched or beat the far larger, far heavier machines on steep, loose terrain. Not because it was more powerful, but because its short wheelbase and independent geometry let it place wheels precisely where a longer, solid axle four-wheel drive couldn't fit. Rally raid teams took the same lesson to Dakar in the early 1980s, and the results weren't close calls. A privateer, Lada Niva, finished second overall at the Paris-Dakar Rally in both 1982 and 1983, beating factory-backed Range Rovers, Mercedes G-Wagons, and Land Cruisers on the same stages with a fraction of their budget. The Niva's true skill was never brute strength. It simply never needed to fight the ground the way a solid axle Land Cruiser did. Nearly 50 years later, the same basic chassis is still in production in Russia, virtually unchanged in concept, because nobody has found a compelling reason to replace an idea that already worked the first time. A four-wheel drive doesn't need 6 figures of engineering budget to outcorner a legend on a switchback. It just needs a chassis built to keep every wheel on the ground when the ground itself refuses to cooperate, which is exactly the one job the Niva was designed around from its very first prototype. Owners who've run both back-to-back on the same trail consistently report the same surprise. The tiny Soviet hatchback, with a fraction of the ground clearance, somehow keeps pace on the technical sections where wheel placement, not raw power, decides who gets stuck. That's the whole argument in one line. Independent geometry doing a heavier machine's job on a fraction of the budget. If a 50-year-old Soviet economy car can still hang with a Land Cruiser on a technical trail, what does that say about how much of capability is actually just marketing? Number 4. Nissan Patrol GQ/Y60. Nissan built the GQ Patrol with one target in its sights, and the badge on the Land Cruiser's hood wasn't subtle about who that target was. When the Y60 launched in 1987 with Nissan's first coil-sprung suspension and a 5-link solid axle setup at both ends, independent testers didn't file it as a curiosity. They handed it real awards, the same year it arrived on dealer lots. Nissan Australia's own 70th anniversary retrospective confirms the GQ Patrol swept both the 4x4, Australia and Overlander magazine 4 WD of the Year titles in 1987, on debut, against a field that included the period Toyota Land Cruiser as the reigning benchmark it was expected to lose to. Coil springs weren't a comfort gimmick in this context. Compared to the leaf-sprung suspension the Land Cruiser was still running at the time, Coil springs allowed dramatically more axle articulation, which meant the GQ Patrol could keep all four tires in contact with uneven ground, where a stiffer leaf-sprung rival would lift a wheel entirely and lose traction at exactly the wrong moment. Combine that with a torquey 4.2-litre inline-six and a genuinely low-range gear, and testers found a four-wheel drive that matched the Land Cruiser's payload and towing credentials while out-articulating it on the exact rutted, uneven terrain those magazine judges were scoring against in the field trials. The GQ never displaced the Land Cruiser's reputation with everyday buyers, partly because Nissan's dealer network and long-term reliability story never quite matched Toyota's decades-long head start. But reputation and judge results aren't the same contest. In the 1 year both trucks were evaluated side by side by people whose entire job was picking the better off-roader, independent panels twice picked the coil-sprung Nissan over the leaf-sprung Toyota. That's not a fan theory built on nostalgia. That's the scored outcome of the actual real-world test this entire list is built around measuring. Australian four-wheel drive publications have referenced that 1987 sweep in Patrol retrospectives ever since, treating it as the moment the segment's assumed pecking order briefly got rewritten by judge results instead of dealer lot momentum. Two separate panels reaching the same verdict in the same year is difficult to write off as a fluke or a marketing favor. If two separate panels of judges picked the Patrol over the Land Cruiser in the same year, why did the Land Cruiser still win the reputation war? Number 3, Range Rover Classic. Land Rover didn't wait for the Land Cruiser to prove itself at Dakar. It got there first and won outright before Toyota's off-road reputation had fully formed in the public imagination. At the inaugural 1979 Paris-Dakar Rally, a modified Range Rover driven by Alain Genestier, Joseph Terbiot, and Jean Lemordant crossed the finish line, first overall, out of 182 starters and only 74 finishers, on a course that ran over 6,000 miles through the Sahara from Paris to Senegal. 2 years later, the Range Rover did it again. René Mege and Bernard Giroux took outright victory at the 1981 event, making the Range Rover the only four-wheel drive to win the very first Dakar rally, and repeat the win within its first 3 runnings of the entire event. What made the Range Rover so dominant in that era wasn't a purpose-built rally chassis. The winning trucks were close to stock, running the same coil-sprung live axles and permanent four-wheel drive system sold to civilian buyers at the local dealership, with little more than an extra fuel tank and roll protection added for the desert crossing itself. Coil springs gave the Range Rover far more wheel travel than the leaf-sprung Land Cruisers of the same period, letting it maintain speed over the washboard and dune terrain that punished stiffer suspensions, while a genuinely low-range transfer case handled the technical sections other entries had to slow to a crawl for. Land Rover's marketing never leaned as hard into unbreakable mythology as Toyota's did, which is likely why this back-to-back Dakar result gets left out of most toughest 4x4 conversations today. But 2 outright wins in the world's hardest endurance rally, on a course the Land Cruiser wouldn't win outright until years later, is about as real a test as this genre gets. And the Range Rover already passed it twice, in front of the entire world's motorsport press, before most people had even decided the Land Cruiser was the benchmark to measure everything else against. Land Rover historians still point to those back-to-back wins as the moment Dakar organizers realized a road-legal, dealer-available four-wheel drive could beat purpose-built rally specials, a distinction that mattered as much to the sport's credibility as it did to Solihull's. Winning the very first Dakar outright, then repeating it, set a bar few manufacturers of any era have come close to touching since. Does winning the very first Dakar, then winning it again, count for more than 4 decades of dealer lot folklore or less? Number 2, Mercedes-Benz G-Wagen, 280, GE/W460. Mercedes-Benz didn't just build a Land Cruiser rival in the W460, it beat the field outright at the sport's biggest stage, while the Land Cruiser was still building its reputation one dealer testimonial at a time. At the 1983 Paris-Dakar Rally, a Mercedes 280G driven by Jackie Ickx and Claude Brasseur won the car category overall, while a separate Mercedes truck entry won the truck category the same year, making Mercedes-Benz the only manufacturer in Dakar history to win the race outright in two different vehicle categories in a single event. That's not a class placing or a spec sheet claim. That's beating every other four-wheel drive entered, full stop, in the year that mattered most to the sport's early legitimacy. The W460 earned that result honestly. Solid axles front and rear, a boxy body built on a rigid ladder frame, and, depending on trim, locking differentials that could plant power to whichever wheel still had grip, gave the early G-Wagen a mechanical simplicity that held up under sustained desert abuse, better than more comfort-oriented rivals of the same period. It wasn't the quickest four-wheel drive in the Dakar field, but it didn't need to be. It needed to still be running on stage 12, while faster machines broke down in the dunes. And Ickx's win proved that durability, not outright speed, decides who actually finishes first in an endurance event this punishing. Toyota has plenty of Land Cruiser endurance stories, but none of them include an outright Dakar win against a full international field of factory-backed competitors on a genuinely open course. Mercedes has that trophy, from a boxy military-derived wagon that's still recognizably in production today under a different generation's badge. When the real test was an actual competition, rather than a dealership brochure or a well-worn owner's forum thread, the G-Wagen already won it, decisively, in front of the entire motorsport world. Even Mercedes-Benz's own later G-Class marketing has leaned on that 1983 result for decades, a rare case of a manufacturer's off-road bragging rights, resting on an actual verifiable finishing position, rather than an anecdote passed between dealership sales staff. A category win against a full international field, in the same year, remains a result Toyota's own competition history has never quite matched. Does one manufacturer winning two categories at the same Dakar in the same year settle this argument outright, or is that still not enough to change anyone's mind? Number 1. Mitsubishi Pajero. No four-wheel drive on this list, or arguably in automotive history, has a stronger case against the Land Cruiser than the one sitting in the Guinness Book of World Records. Mitsubishi holds the record for most Dakar rally wins by an automobile manufacturer, with the Pajero taking 12 outright victories between 1985 and 2007, backed by roughly 150 individual stage wins along the way, nearly double the stage win total of the next closest manufacturer in the sport's entire history. That's not a class trophy or a single lucky year. That's more than 2 decades of a four-wheel drive built specifically to be raced beating every other manufacturer's entry, repeatedly, on the hardest endurance course the sport has ever produced. The Pajero was developed from 1982 as a direct answer to the Land Cruiser's dominance in Japan's domestic four-wheel drive market, and Mitsubishi proved the point almost immediately. The modified rally Pajero won its production class debut at Dakar in 1983, the year after the road car launched, then repeated the class win the following year, before the model graduated to outright overall victories from 1985 onward against the entire international field. Independent front suspension gave it an articulation advantage over solid axle rivals in the dunes, and Mitsubishi's part-time four-wheel drive system was engineered to switch on the fly without the driver stopping. A small mechanical edge that mattered enormously over thousands of miles of changing desert terrain and shifting sand conditions. Mitsubishi's dominant stretch, 7 consecutive outright wins during one run in the 2000s, is a level of sustained competitive superiority the Land Cruiser has never once approached in Dakar's outright car standings across the event's entire history. When people say a four-wheel drive is the toughest, they usually just mean it survives. The Pajero didn't just survive. For the better part of a quarter century, It was the fastest survivor on Earth's hardest desert course, and the record books still say so today. Rally historians still cite the Pajero's 2002 Dakar performance, where Mitsubishi swept the top 9 overall positions on a single event, as one of the most one-sided results any manufacturer has produced in the sport's history. 12 outright wins against a Land Cruiser tally of 0 in the same event is about as clear a scoreboard as this list produces. 12 outright Dakar wins to the Land Cruiser's 0. Is there any argument left for the Land Cruiser being the tougher truck, or does the scoreboard end the conversation? 12-0. That's not folklore, that's a scoreboard, and it's the reason this list closed the way it did. None of this makes the Land Cruiser a bad four-wheel drive. It makes it one very good four-wheel drive, among several that beat it fair and square when it counted. Which one on this list surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments, and subscribe for more honest four-wheel drive comparisons every week.